Every week for 3 years, someone left white chrysanthemums on his brother's grave. And the day Kang Ji-woo finally hid in the shadows long enough to find out who, he discovered a truth that would either save his soul or destroy the last piece of humanity he had left. The cemetery on the eastern edge of Seoul breathed differently in the early morning. It exhaled mist like a living thing, curling between the granite stones in slow, deliberate rolls, as if the earth itself was reluctant to give up the warmth of the dead sleeping beneath it. Kang Ji-woo had been coming to this place every Sunday for 3 years, and in 3 years he had never once felt at peace standing before his younger brother's headstone. Peace was not a thing that men like him were permitted to feel. Peace was for civilians, for the innocent, for people who had never ordered another man's fingers broken over a debt or watched someone drown in the Han River without lifting a hand to save them. Ji-woo was not that kind of man. He had not been that kind of man for a very long time, and his brother, his gentle, kind, foolishly trusting younger brother Ji-hoon, had paid the price for being related to someone like him. The headstone was simple. Ji-woo had chosen it himself, rejecting the elaborate marble monuments his lieutenants had suggested, the ones with gold inlay and carved dragons that screamed power and money to anyone passing by. Ji-hoon had hated ostentation. He had been a teacher, a middle school art teacher who brought extra sandwiches to school every day because there were always a few students whose families couldn't afford a proper lunch. He had worn the same coat for 6 winters because he liked how it felt, not because he couldn't afford a new one. He had laughed too loudly and apologized for things that weren't his fault, and believed, with a sincerity that Ji-woo had always privately found both admirable and naive, that people were mostly good underneath their worst choices. Ji-hoon had believed that about Ji-woo too, right up until the end. He had been killed because of Ji-woo, not directly. There were no fingerprints, no clear line of causation that a court of law would ever recognize. But Ji-woo knew. The rival faction that had been pressing against his territory 3 years ago had sent a message in the most devastating language available to men without conscience. They had not touched Ji-woo. They had touched the thing he loved most. Ji-hoon had been walking home from school on a Tuesday afternoon in October, carrying a canvas his students had painted for him as a birthday gift, and a car had come around the corner, too fast, too deliberately, and that had been the end of Kang Ji-hoon. 29 years old, beloved teacher, his brother's only remaining family, the only person on earth who had still called Ji-woo by his childhood nickname. In the months after the funeral, Ji-woo had responded with the kind of methodical, total devastation that had made his name into something people whispered. The rival faction no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Their leader had disappeared. Their assets had been absorbed. Their lieutenants had scattered to other cities, other countries, grateful simply to be alive and breathing. Ji-woo had felt nothing during any of it. Not satisfaction, not relief, not the closure that revenge was supposed to provide. He had felt nothing, and he continued to feel nothing. And he came to this cemetery every Sunday morning because it was the only hour of the week when he allowed himself to stand still and admit that he was completely, irreparably alone. It was on the fourth Sunday of November, in the second year after Ji-hoon's death, that Ji-woo first noticed the flowers. He had been so consumed in those early months by grief, and then by violence, and then by the hollow aftermath of violence, that he had paid little attention to the state of the grave itself beyond keeping it clean and maintained. But that November morning he arrived to find a bouquet of white chrysanthemums placed carefully against the base of the headstone, tied with a small piece of pale twine, fresh enough that the petals still held their shape against the cold air. He had stopped several feet away and stared at them for a long time. He assumed initially that it was one of his men, someone from his organization paying respects, perhaps out of loyalty or superstition, or a genuine fondness for the brother of their boss. He made quiet inquiries the following week. No one admitted to it. He asked more directly, in the way that men in his position ask questions that required honest answers, and still nothing. Not one of his 63 subordinates had placed those flowers. He thought perhaps it was a neighbor, someone from Ji-hoon's building who had liked him. He thought perhaps it was a former student, grown sentimental. He told himself it was a small thing, an inexplicable kindness, and he tried to let it go. But the flowers kept coming. Every single week, without fail, through winter cold and spring rain, and the humid crush of summer and back into autumn again. Fresh white chrysanthemums, always the same, always tied with pale twine, always placed with an ornament that suggested the person doing it understood exactly what they were honoring. By the end of the second year, Jiwoo had stopped trying to reason it away. Someone who had loved his brother was coming to this grave weekly, consistently, devotedly, and they were doing it without any expectation of recognition or gratitude. In a life populated almost entirely by people who performed loyalty as a transaction, this anonymous faithfulness struck him as the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered. He needed to know who it was. He told himself it was a security concern that unknown individuals visiting his brother's grave represented a vulnerability. He told himself many reasonable things, but the truth, the real truth that he only admitted to himself in the dark of his apartment at 3 in the morning, was that whoever was leaving those flowers was the only person outside his own chest who seemed to still be grieving Jihoon, and Jiwoo needed that. He needed it more than he had ever needed anything that his money or his power or his reputation could provide. He began to plan. He began to wait. He had positioned himself among the trees before dawn, standing far enough back that the mist provided cover, close enough that he would see anyone who approached the grave clearly. He had done this 3 Sundays in a row before she appeared, and when she did, he understood immediately why he had missed her before. She moved through the cemetery with a quiet purposefulness that suggested someone who had learned, perhaps from necessity, to take up as little space as possible in the world. She was not Korean. That was the first thing he registered. And then he was immediately ashamed of registering it because Jihoon would have been disappointed in him for letting it be the first thing. And even dead, his brother had that power over him. She was a young woman, perhaps mid-20s, dressed in a long gray coat that was practical rather than fashionable, with a cream-colored head wrap that caught the early light as she moved between the headstones with easy familiarity. She knew where she was going. She did not consult any markers or pause to orient herself. She walked directly to Jihoon's grave as if she had done it so many times that her feet remembered the path independently of her mind. She was carrying the chrysanthemums, white, fresh, tied with pale twine. Jiwoo watched her kneel. He watched her remove the previous week's flowers, which had begun to brown and curl at the edges, and set them aside carefully, not throwing them away but placing them gently on the ground as if even their ending deserved consideration. She then positioned the new bouquet against the headstone with both hands, adjusting the angle with small, deliberate movements until she was satisfied. And then she was still. She knelt in front of his brother's grave in the morning mist with her head slightly bowed, and Jiwoo watched her lips move and understood that she was speaking, though he was too far away to hear words. Whatever she was saying, she said it at length. She was not reciting a quick prayer and leaving. She was having a conversation with the stone, with whatever she believed existed on the other side of the stone, with the memory of the man buried beneath it, and the intimacy of it was so acute that Jiwoo felt he was intruding on something sacred. He should have stepped forward immediately. He was not a man who hesitated. Hesitation in his world was a liability that could get a person killed, and he had systematically excised it from his character over the course of 15 years, building his organization from nothing. But something held him in place among the trees for several long minutes, while she knelt and spoke, and the mist rolled around both of them, and the early sunlight came through the pines in long golden columns that made the whole scene look like something painted rather than real. He stood and watched and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something moved behind his sternum that was not grief or rage or the cold, functional focus he used to get through his days. When she finally rose, gathering the old flowers to dispose of them properly on her way out, he stepped forward. "You knew my brother," Jiwoo said. It was not a question. He did not phrase things as questions when he already knew the answer. She studied him with an openness that he found disarming. People in his presence almost never looked at him with genuine directness. They looked slightly past him or slightly down, their eyes performing deference even when their mouths were saying brave things. This woman looked directly at him, and she took her time before she responded, as if she was deciding not what to say, but how much of the truth to give and in what order. "Yes," she said finally. Her Korean was accented but fluid, the kind of fluency that came from years of immersive daily use rather than formal study. We were friends. He never mentioned you. Jiwoo watched her face for the micro expressions that people leaked when they were managing information. The small tightenings around the eyes, the brief reconfigurations of the mouth. There was nothing he could read as deception. There was only a kind of careful sorrow. I know, she said, he wouldn't have. We were a particular kind of friends. She paused, glancing back at the headstone, and when she looked at Jiwoo again, there was something in her expression that had softened at its edges, a grief too old and too thoroughly integrated to be performed. The kind that's easier to protect by keeping separate from everything else. She let that sit for a moment, and Jiwoo understood what she was telling him. Understood it not in the sharp, sudden way of revelation, but in the slow, settling way of a thing that had been true all along and was only now being confirmed. Jihoon, his gentle, private, perennially mysterious in small ways brother, had loved this woman, and he had loved her quietly, separately, in the space between his public life and whatever he had kept for himself, and she had let him because she had understood something about the complications that came attached to the Kang family name. Jiwoo looked at the grave and then at her and then at the dead flowers she was still holding in her hands, like something she wasn't ready to put down. Tell me his name, he said. What did you call him when it was just the two of you? She blinked, and for the first time something cracked, very slightly, at the surface of her composure. Jihoona, she said, and the way she said it, with the diminutive, with the affection built into the syllable, told him everything about what they had been to each other. He introduced himself. She told him her name was Amara. They stood on either side of his brother's grave in the dissolving mist and began, very carefully, to speak. Her full name was Amara Diallo, and she had come to Korea 4 years ago from Dakar on a language fellowship that had been extended twice because she was brilliant at what she did, and because she admitted to Jiwoo with a quiet candor that he was still not entirely accustomed to receiving from a near stranger. Korea had begun to feel more like home than she had expected or planned for. She taught French and English at a community center in Mapogu 3 days a week and spent the rest of her time working on a translation project that she described simply as important without elaborating. And Jiwoo, who was practiced in the art of not asking questions people weren't ready to answer, did not push her on it. She had met Jihoon at the community center 14 months before he died. He had come in with 3 of his students, a weekend enrichment program he'd organized himself, entirely on his own time and out of his own pocket, to give kids from lower-income families access to language instruction. And he had gotten the day wrong and arrived an hour before the class was scheduled and ended up sitting in the small kitchen with Amara drinking vending machine coffee and talking for the entire hour until his students arrived. She described that first conversation with a precision of detail that told Jiwoo how many times she had replayed it in her memory, how often she had turned it over to examine it from different angles. Jihoon had asked her about Dakar, genuinely asked, with the focused, unhurried curiosity of someone who had been given an opportunity to learn something new and intended to use it fully. He had asked about the food and the light and what the ocean looked like from the beach at certain times of day, and she had told him. And somewhere in the telling, she had realized she was homesick in a way she hadn't been in years, and that the person sitting across from her had created a space where that particular kind of honesty was possible, and that this was an exceptionally rare thing. They had met weekly after that, usually at the community center, sometimes at a small restaurant near her apartment that did a Senegalese-influenced Korean fusion menu that Jihoon had declared the most interesting food experiment he had ever tasted. He had brought her student artwork sometimes, anonymous pieces, with permission, that he thought she would appreciate. She had read him French poetry in the original and then translated it herself, line by line, so he could hear both versions. They had talked about his students and her fellowship and what it meant to be devoted to something that the world did not particularly value or well compensate. They had talked, gradually and carefully, about his family, specifically about Jiwoo, whom Jihoon had spoken of with an emotion that Amara described to Jiwoo now as the most complicated love she had ever witnessed a person carry. He was so proud of you, she said, watching Jiwoo's face with attention. Not of what you did. He was very clear about that. He never pretended your work was something other than what it was. But proud of you, of who you were inside it, of the fact that you had survived a childhood that had broken other people, of the way you protected the people you considered yours, even when the methods were, she paused, selecting her word, troubling. Jiwoo said nothing. The wind moved through the pines above them and dropped a cold current of air across the back of his neck. He worried about you constantly, Amar continued. That was the thing he came back to most. Not fear for himself. I don't think I ever once heard him express personal fear about being your brother, about the proximity to danger that implied. What kept him awake was you. Whether you were lonely, whether anyone in your life was honest with you, whether you would know how to be a person again if the structures you had built ever came down. She met his eyes steadily. He thought you were extraordinary. He thought you had made yourself into something powerful by destroying something necessary. And he wanted, I think more than anything, to see you find your way back to it. Jiwoo had sat through interrogations and negotiations and confrontations that most men would not survive, and he had maintained his composure through all of them, through a combination of practice and the emotional distance he had carefully cultivated over decades. He maintained it now, barely, by the expedient of looking away. At the headstone, at the winter gray sky through the trees, at his own hands resting on his knees. Why didn't he tell me about you, he said, and it came out less steady than he intended. Amara was quiet for a moment. He was protecting me, she said finally, and maybe protecting what we were to each other. He said once that everything that came close to you had a tendency to become part of the machinery, whether it wanted to or not, and that he was selfish enough to want one thing that stayed outside of it. She said it without accusation, simply as a fact that she had understood and accepted. I think he also knew that if you met me, you would investigate my entire history and probably intimidate several of my colleagues and generally make my life considerably more complicated. The corner of her mouth moved barely towards something that in different circumstances might have been a smile. He was not wrong about that. Jiwoo thought about his brother, keeping her, in a separate pocket of his life, carefully sealed against contamination. He thought about Jihoon carrying the weight of who his brother was through every interaction, every relationship, every casual conversation with a colleague about weekend plans, always aware that the Kang name was a thing that changed the temperature of a room. He thought about what it cost a person to love someone whose existence complicated everything. He thought about Jihoon coming to this woman's small community center with his students and drinking vending machine coffee and talking about Dakar. And he thought about how that hour must have felt, like a room with clean air in a building that had been sealed too long. He loved you, Jiwoo said. It was not a question this time either, but the kind of statement that is both a confirmation and a permission. Amara looked at the grave. Yes, she said, and I loved him. Whatever configuration that took, whatever it was that we had time to become before, she stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. I loved him, and I come here because he deserves to be remembered by someone who chose him, not just by people who were required to, by blood or obligation. Someone who saw exactly who he was and thought, that is a person worth crossing the city for, every week, in the cold, without anyone knowing. He deserves that. Jiwoo sat with this for a long time. The mist had thinned as the morning had progressed, and the cemetery had acquired its daylight character, more ordinary and less mystical. The trees simply trees, the stones simply stones. But his brother's grave with its fresh white chrysanthemums still looked to his eyes like a place where something true was preserved. I'm going to ask you something, he said slowly, and I want you to answer honestly, not because I'm threatening you, but because I think my brother would want us to speak honestly to each other. Amara inclined her head. Will you tell me about him? Jiwoo said. The version you knew. The parts of him that I didn't know existed. Will you by... He stopped. He tried again. He's been gone 3 years and I still don't know how to carry it. And you've been coming here every week for 3 years and I think maybe you've learned something about it that I haven't. I would like to understand how you do it. The silence that followed was the kind that considers rather than evades. Amara looked at him with those steady, assessing eyes, and whatever she was looking for in his face, she seemed to find enough of it to make a decision. Come back next Sunday, she said. I'll bring coffee. Real coffee, not from a machine. And I'll tell you everything. He came back the next Sunday. He brought nothing because he was not practiced in the gestures of ordinary human softness, and he did not want to produce something wrong. Amara was already there when he arrived, kneeling by the grave with the fresh flowers in place, her lips moving in the private conversation she had with Jihoon each week. Jiwoo stood at a respectful distance until she rose, and then they settled on a low stone bench nearby that was provided by the cemetery for exactly this kind of extended grief. And she produced a thermos of coffee that was, as she had promised, genuinely good. And they sat with the steam rising from their cups into the cold morning air, and she began to talk. She talked for 2 hours. She talked about the first month, when they had been formally polite with each other, carefully circumspect. Two people who sensed they might become important to each other and were therefore moving slowly. She talked about the evening Jihoon had shown up at the community center with clay on his shirt because one of his students had been upset, and he had spontaneously run an after-school pottery session to settle everyone's nerves. The clay had not come all the way out in the wash, and he had seemed completely unbothered by this. And she had thought, watching him not be bothered, that she had never known a man so thoroughly secure in his own goodness. Not in an arrogant way, but in the way of someone who had simply decided what kind of person he was going to be and had been that person consistently enough that it no longer required effort. She talked about the arguments they had had, small ones, about pedagogy, and about how much personal financial sacrifice a person could reasonably be expected to make in service of ideals before the sacrifice became destructive rather than noble. She talked about a Saturday in July when they had taken a bus to the coast on impulse and sat on rocks above the water eating convenience store kimbap and watching cargo ships on the horizon. And Jihoon had told her about the summer he was 12 years old and Jiwoo had taken him to the beach for the first and only time, and how it had rained the entire day, and they had stayed anyway, huddled under a gas station tarp that Jiwoo had acquired somewhere, eating soaked crackers, and how that had been one of the best days of his childhood. Jiwoo remembered that day. He had forgotten it, entirely, thoughtlessly, the way you forget things that do not fit into the narrative you have constructed about your own life. And hearing it described through his brother's mouth, told to this woman on a rock above the sea, was profoundly disorienting. He had carried Jihoon's death as evidence of his own destruction, as proof of the transactional violence his existence visited on everything it touched. He had not carried the memory of a soaked gas station tarp and bad crackers and his 12-year-old brother laughing at the rain. Amara watched him absorb this and said nothing, which was the right response, and he liked her more for it. He came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. They did not announce this to each other as a continuing arrangement. It simply continued the way things do when they are filling a need that neither party has adequately named. She told him more about Jihoon, and he told her things in return, things he had told no one, things that had been stored under pressure for 3 years. The phone call he had not answered on the day Jihoon died because he had been in a meeting and had thought, I'll call him back tonight. It's fine. There is always more time. The art project Jihoon had sent him a photo of the week before he died, one of his students' paintings, saying simply, thought you'd like this one, and how Jiwoo had not responded because he had not known what to say, and how that unreturned message still sat in his phone like a bruise, the precise texture of the guilt he carried, which was not the dramatic, consuming guilt of fiction, but something quieter and more persistent, a constant, low-grade awareness that he had built a life that required the sacrifice of everything tender, and then been surprised when the sacrifice was collected. Amara listened to all of it. She did not offer absolution, which would have been false, or minimization, which would have been worse. She listened with the particular quality of attention that Jiwoo was beginning to understand had been one of Jihoon's great gifts as a teacher and seemed to be one of hers as well. Not passive reception, but active, engaged witnessing. The message of which was not that your pain is solvable, but that your pain is real, and I will sit here with you while you hold it. There were things between them that were not spoken directly in those months, but accumulated in the silences between sentences. A careful attention to the other's comfort, a gradual lowering of the particular social armor each of them wore in the world outside the cemetery. Jiwoo had not had a friendship, an actual friendship, equal and honest and uncontaminated by the power dynamics of his professional life, in so long that he had genuinely forgotten what the interior of one felt like. He was relearning it one Sunday at a time, beside his brother's grave, with a woman who had loved his brother in ways he was still mapping and who seemed to see him, Jiwoo, with an accuracy that was not comfortable but that was, he was slowly deciding, necessary. One Sunday in spring, almost 5 months after they had first spoken, Amara brought a photograph she had found in her apartment while reorganizing. Ji-hoon at the community center, seated at a table with four of his students, all of them bent over something they were making. Ji-hoon's face turned slightly toward the camera with that particular expression he had had, the one that was not quite a smile but was entirely contentment. Jiwoo held the photograph for a long time. He asked if he could keep it, and she said yes. Of course, it was why she had brought it. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket against his chest, which he was aware was a gesture so transparent in its emotional significance that the old version of himself would have been contemptuous of it. He was no longer certain he had the right to be contemptuous of things like that. That afternoon, after they had said goodbye at the cemetery gate, and he was in the back of his car being driven through the city, he took out the photograph and looked at it again. His brother. His brother, alive in this moment, absorbed in this act of care for other people's children, giving again what he always gave without depletion and without resentment, believing as he apparently believed until the end that the world was made of possibilities rather than transactions. Jiwoo thought about what Amara had told him in their first real conversation, that Ji-hoon had wanted, above everything, to see his brother find his way back to something necessary. He had not specified what the something was, perhaps because he had trusted Jiwoo to recognize it when he found it. Jiwoo looked at the photograph. He looked out the window at Seoul moving past in its spring configuration, cherry blossoms already peaked and beginning to fall in the soft pink accumulations along the sidewalks, the city doing what cities do, continuing regardless. He thought he might know what the something was. He thought it might be this: the willingness to sit beside someone else's grief and your own without requiring it to resolve into anything more useful than what it simply, plainly was. Love, loss, the specific weight of a person you cannot stop missing. The extraordinary ordinary fact of showing up, week after week, with fresh flowers, because some things deserve to be honored for as long as you are able to honor them, regardless of whether anyone is watching, regardless of what it costs you, simply because the person you lost was worth it. He told his driver to take a different route home, one that went past the community center in Mapogu, where his brother had brought his students, where it had begun. He didn't know why exactly. He just needed to see the building. He needed to see the place where Ji-hoon had been happy in a way that had nothing to do with him. He rolled down the window as they passed. It was a Saturday and the center was busy, voices audible from the street, someone laughing somewhere inside with the unguarded fullness of a person who forgot, for a moment, to be careful. Jiwoo listened until the car moved past and the laughter faded into the general sound of the city, and then he raised the window and sat in the silence and pressed his hand flat against the photograph in his inside pocket and felt for the first time in 3 years something in his chest that was not grief's negative, not the absence of peace, not the hollow where something had been taken, but grief's strange coexisting companion, gratitude. Gratitude that Ji-hoon had existed, that he had been loved, fully, by someone who had sought him out and kept returning to him and still came to his grave in the cold every week with white chrysanthemums and did not intend to stop. Gratitude that Jiwoo had been stubborn enough, or broken enough, or maybe human enough, to stand in the trees that morning and wait. A story about grief, brotherhood, and the strangers our loved ones keep, who sometimes become the people who teach us how to remember them right.